I've been there spending a few $100 on a bargain welder that promises everything, only to discover it can't hold a steady arc on a thin sheet, the torch feels like a dead weight, and the power cords don't even fit my shop's outlet. The regret that follows is a mix of wasted money and a half-finished project that suddenly looks way more complicated than it should. That's why I wanted to see if Miller's Multimatic 220 actually lives up to the promise of being a smarter, all-in-one solution instead of another cheap disappointment. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The first thing I did was pull the box into my garage and lay out everything that comes with it: a MIG gun, a TIG torch, a set of connectors for both 120V and 240V, and a compact control panel that looks more like a kitchen appliance than a heavy-duty machine. Right away, the packaging feels intentional. Miller isn't trying to hide any accessories, and the inclusion of both MIG and TIG heads means you can walk away from the bench with two completely different welding processes at your fingertips. For anyone who's ever owned a single-process machine and then had to buy a second one for a different job, that's a tangible time saver. What matters most in a shop is how quickly you can get from unpacked to welding. Setting up the Multimatic was surprisingly straightforward. The power selector knob clicks into place for 120V or 240V, and the included adapters fit standard North American outlets without the need for an extra transformer. Once you attach the MIG gun, the machine boots up, and the digital readout shows voltage and amperage in real time. That immediate feedback is a big win if you're a hobbyist who still wants to understand the numbers but doesn't want to stare at a manual for 10 minutes before each session. In practice, the ability to switch between MIG, Flux-Cored, and TIG on the fly is where the Multimatic starts to earn its price tag. I used the MIG setup to run a quick repair on a backyard fence, feeding a 0.023-inch wire through a 20-amp setting on 120V. The arc stayed consistent, the bead adhered smoothly to the mild steel, and I didn't have to constantly tweak the wire feed speed. A few weeks later, I moved to a thin aluminum panel for a custom lampshade, flipped the torch to TIG, dropped the voltage to a lower range, and was able to create a clean, precise weld without the usual porosity that plagues cheaper TIG units. The transition felt natural, almost like swapping out a drill bit, and that flexibility is exactly what a small shop owner or serious DIYer needs when the next project could be steel, aluminum, or even stainless. That said, the Multimatic isn't a magic wand. Its power output caps at 220 amps, which is plenty for most home and light commercial jobs but starts to feel limiting if you're cutting into thick structural steel on a regular basis. I tried a inch plate on 240V, and while the machine held the arc, it required a slower travel speed to avoid burn-through, which can be a bit tiring on larger jobs. Also, because the unit packs 3 processes into one chassis, it's heavier than a single-process MIG machine you might find at a discount store. Moving it around the shop takes a little planning, especially if you don't have a dedicated rolling cart. Who should consider buying the Multimatic? If you're a hobbyist who jumps from project to project, maybe a weekend fabricator, a marine enthusiast repairing boat hulls, or a small-scale metal artist who needs both MIG for steel and TIG for aluminum, this machine hits a sweet spot. The fact that you get 3 processes, a reliable brand reputation, and a dual-voltage setup without hunting down separate units means you spend less time buying gear and more time actually building. It also makes sense for a startup shop that wants to keep its footprint small while still offering a range of welding capabilities to clients. On the flip side, if you're a professional fabricator whose daily workload revolves around heavy-duty, high-amperage MIG on thick plate, you'll probably be better served by a dedicated, higher-output machine that can sustain a 300-amp or higher output without stepping down the travel speed. Similarly, if your shop already has a solid TIG setup and you only need a MIG gun for occasional use, the added weight and price of a multi-process unit may not justify the convenience. One subtle trade-off that shows up after a few weeks of use is the learning curve around the control panel's process select menu. The interface is intuitive once you've clicked through it a couple of times, but the first few welds can feel a bit tentative as you double-check that you're in the right mode. It's not a fatal flaw, but it's worth noting if you're in a hurry to finish a job and don't have the luxury of a set-it-and-forget-it machine. Another practical consideration is the consumable cost. Because the package includes a MIG gun and